Hello, everyone. We are getting ready to kick off our May professional interview. We are going to be chatting with the Weld County District Attorney, Michael J. Rourke, and we're also going to be speaking with survivor Kimberly Corban. We are just waiting for them to enter the live. Kimberly's on, so I'm going to invite Kimberly in. So hopefully this works. I just invited both of you in.
Yep.
There we go. There's Kimberly.
There we go.
Hello to both of you.
Hi, Allison.
I was making sure his was set up all right, but we didn't want to have any feedback.
That makes sense.
You know what they say about lawyers and technology. Not a good mix.
Well, we lost Kimberly, so give me a second to find her, get her back in.
Okay.
Perhaps. There she is.
All good.
We'll try this again. Well, happy Tuesday to both of you.
You too.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. You want to just jump right in?
Sure.
You
fire away, Allison.
Well, I introduced you both before you were actually on, but I'll do it again really quickly. We have Kimberly Corban. Many of you will recognize her. She's the face of our Instagram Reels. She's a survivor and advocate. And we have the Weld County District Attorney, Michael Rourke, with us today. And we're going to be talking about prosecuting sexual assault cases. So tell us, Michael, a little bit about your work, your experience.
Sure.
Let's get started.
You bet. I've been a criminal prosecutor for almost 27 years now. I graduated from law school in 1997, and I immediately went into the prosecution community. I worked in a Metropolitan DA's office down as part of the metro area in Denver for about 8 years, and then I've been up in Weld County since 2005. I started in Weld County as a chief deputy, was promoted to assistant in 2007, and then I've been the elected district attorney since 2015. And during that time, I've prosecuted first-degree murder cases, sexual assault. I spent quite a bit of time prosecuting crimes against children. Pretty much all of the violent crime that you can imagine has had to cross my desk at some point during my 27-year career.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit specifically about prosecuting sexual assault cases, the challenges, the nuances of these difficult cases?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for asking me, because it's a difficult topic to talk about. From a prosecutor's perspective, these are some of the most difficult cases to prosecute. And I think largely those challenges are external to the prosecutions. In other words, we unfortunately live in a culture or a society that makes these cases very difficult to prosecute. They have the juries and some of the community that we prosecute in have certain expectations of what a sexual assault prosecution should look like. They have an expectation of what a sexual assault survivor should look like, how they should respond to a trauma, how they should behave, if you will, to avoid being a victim in the first place. And that is an absolutely abhorrent notion to us in the prosecution community, because we know that's simply not true. We spend a lot of time in jury selection in the cases that we can get to trial, trying to disabuse the jury of some of these antiquated notions about these cases, these prosecutions, and what they should expect. Oftentimes, juries have unrealistic expectations as a whole on the physical evidence that they believe that they're going to see or hear during the course of a trial. They have expectations that there should be eyewitnesses, there should be an immediate outcry. All of these things that we know, and I think the folks who are watching this know, simply aren't prevalent in many of these prosecutions. And so those are some of the hurdles that we as prosecutors try to overcome from the minute a report is made to law enforcement, and really, Allison, even before that. We really want to try to get the message out that those things can't and shouldn't be considered, so that when someone is a victim, they should have an expectation of what the criminal justice system should look like from a response standpoint. And unfortunately, we're just not there yet as a profession as a whole.
I'm glad you brought up juries. One of the, I think, more shocking, startling responses I've heard was a survivor in the Kansas City area. She was sexually assaulted in her apartment, and the jury found the defendant not guilty. And when they asked the jury members, you know, how they made their decision, one of the women spoke up and said that she didn't like how the survivor kept her house.
We fight the concept or the notion that we hear from juries all the time about why did the victim dress the way she did? Why was she out that late? Why did she have too much to drink? Why aren't those same questions asked about other types of criminal activity? When somebody is the victim of an aggravated robbery, why isn't the first question that society should expect, why was she out that late? That doesn't happen. But it does in these kinds of cases. And those are some of those, like I said, antiquated beliefs in some segments of society that we've got to get past and got to get around. And it's those little petty beliefs that really cause us some difficulty in prosecuting these cases, sometimes successfully.
Mm-hmm. I want to share a second story to kind of show the opposite side. One of the Start by Believing communities in Ohio, Summit County, they prosecute a case that was drug facilitated sexual assault. And one of the jury members, after a conviction, stated that she knew that the survivor could not consent because they were under the influence. And just that the feeling from the prosecuting attorney's office that the messages they were sending were getting out into the community, that it was making an impact, and people were understanding what sexual assault actually looked like. So
yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that Start by Believing, because my office is one that is very strongly subscribes to that that belief, that ideal that EVAW is putting out there about Start by Believing, because it is so absolutely crucial. And I know you're going to ask me about cases I've prosecuted here in a few minutes, but if law enforcement, if the initial responding officer, or if the first detective starts by believing the victim when he or she comes in to report a crime, it makes such a big difference in the success and the ability to overcome some of those hurdles that I've talked about, because you do start to develop that relationship with a victim, with a survivor, that is so crucial to really conveying a message and convincing a jury that the defendant is guilty of the crime that he or she's been charged with.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because it really does start from the very beginning. One of our very first ever online training institute module is on effective report writing. And it is directly because patrol officers were completing these reports. They were not using the language of non-consensual sex. They were getting to prosecution, and prosecutors were saying, we can't do anything with this because this looks like a consensual act. And that's the whole premise of writing that training module, and really starting from that very beginning, knowing that it impacts prosecution later on.
Yep, absolutely. And not only that, the inability or the refusal to consent, but also to dispel the notion that there are so many false reports that occur around the country. And that we just know from a prosecution standpoint, from a law enforcement standpoint, that doesn't happen. They are such an incredibly small percentage of a percentage that it's really not even worth talking about or considering, yet we still have to overcome that as well.
Absolutely. So let's talk about a specific case that Start by Believing played an important role.
It might be one that involves the other guest on your Instagram Live as well. In very short, I was the chief deputy district attorney who was overseeing our sexual assault prosecutions in 2006 when Kim's reports of her assault crossed my desk. And really in Colorado, and I think probably in many jurisdictions around the country, we have a very short period of time in which to make a charging decision on many of these cases that come in. And that's because an offender has either been arrested or we have a real time crunch in terms of getting a charging decision made. At the very beginning of June of 2006, the reports about Kimberly's assault crossed my desk. An offender had been arrested, and I had to make a decision within 3 days about whether or not we were going to charge him and prosecute him. And at the time, and certainly since then as well, physical evidence wasn't tested in that short amount of time. We didn't have forensic evidence back in that amount of time. And so what I had was about a 15 or 20 page set of reports on my desk that was largely Kim's report of the assault that had occurred to her. And really the question that was left in all of our minds is, do we have the right offender? And very candidly, Kim could not immediately identify by sight or ever, frankly, her assailant, but she was able to do a voice identification. That was different from many of the other prosecutions we had considered over the course of my career. And so in reading those reports, we had very little physical evidence to consider. I had her voice report and a very compelling report about her stranger sexual assault. And I had to make that choice within 3 days whether or not we were going to file charges and prosecute this offender, like I said. And we chose, even before Start by Believing was a campaign, before it was even really a thought in anyone's mind, that's exactly what we did. We had to start by believing because when we talk about her case in trainings and in presentations, I could not imagine going and sitting down in a conference room with her or her support group, her parents, and say to them, we know that there is some evidence that this may be the right guy, but I don't have enough to charge him. That's something that I couldn't fathom, couldn't imagine doing. And so we started by believing her. And I'm certainly glad we did, because you know what? She was right. She was right that the voice identification for her offender was the person who had done this to her. It was later confirmed by the forensic testing that we got, but had law enforcement, victim advocates from the very beginning, prosecutors in my office not believed her, that offender would have walked out the door after a couple of days in custody. And how many more victims would we have had before we learned that, in fact, we did have the right offender in custody? And he has not seen the light of day since that day, in large part because of all of the efforts and courage it took for Kim to come forward and tell her story.
Kim, do you want to talk a little bit about walking through that process? And
Yeah. When Michael and I do this training on my case together, you know, he kind of takes the part where we're having that first meeting, and I come in with my parents and we're sitting around the conference room table because I don't really have a lot of firsthand memory of that. I was pretty checked out. As we know, it's called dissociation, but that was something that he definitely remembered. I don't remember the things necessarily that he and Rob and the victim witness assistant had said. I remember walking out of there feeling like I was believed, like this was their priority. They are going to fight for me, for justice on behalf of the community. And that was a feeling that I left with. That in and of itself is a testament to what the Start by Believing campaign does. And so I felt that every step of the way. And I think that the communication that was offered from the prosecution and even law enforcement prior to that is what made me feel like an active participant as opposed to just another case number on a docket.
can you talk a little bit about the actual trial itself and being on the stand? And
Yeah, Michael, I'll let you start with that one.
Sure. Without going through many of the details that Kim identifies in the course of our presentation and that she endured because we don't have time, there were a lot of hurdles that we had to overcome even to get her on the stand in the first place. She's talked very publicly about some of the PTSD, the effects of PTSD, the seizures that she had, some of the other issues that she and her family ran into courtesy of the mental health community here in Weld County at the time, unfortunately. We had a lot of hurdles to get her on the stand. When we prepared her for trial, one of the things that I talk about that looking back we did was we treated Kim like a child. And I say that very respectfully because I knew that she was at risk for breaking down and having a seizure in the middle of something very traumatic, like having to relive this on a witness stand 6 feet from her attacker in front of a jury box full of strangers. So when I talk about treating her like a child, what we did was we brought her into the courtroom. We showed her where the jury was going to be sitting, where the judge is sitting, where my trial partner and I and our detective would be sitting, where the defendant was sitting. Knowing that she couldn't identify him in the courtroom, we could legally show her this is where the defendant is going to be sitting, so that you know, so you don't walk in and all of a sudden you're surprised that he's so close to you. And then what we did was, instead of preparing her by walking her through every question we were going to ask her and run the risk of losing the emotional reaction to her talking about this horrible assault, we prepared her very generically, knowing that she knew the answers to them, mostly. What I talk about is she didn't get everything right. There's no doubt she got things out of order that we knew from the reports. She didn't identify certain things that had occurred during the assault itself. And that was okay, because that wasn't the main part of the story. But really what we did was treated that way so that we got, unfortunately, what the jury expected to see in an emotional reaction from her talking about the trauma. And I had to walk her through and ask her some of the most horrific questions you can imagine asking another human being in a very sterile environment like a courtroom in front of a bunch of strangers. Kim, talk about what that was like.
Well, and I think it's interesting. So these guys describe it as treating me like a child, when actually I didn't see it as necessarily a child victim. It's more, it's interesting or helpful information in a way that somebody who is regressing mentally because of trauma can process. They can understand it. My parents were a huge piece of this because I'm 20. I'm not that much outside of being a legal child. However, that state of trauma really can have a big impact, and you can act ways that you don't think that you're going to until you're actually in that situation. So the constant communication was really helpful. When we went through trial prep, again, it's more of that feeling. I don't remember the exact questions Michael was asking me during prep. I know they were generic, but again, I felt believed every step of the way. So that when I did get on the stand, I was emotionally and mentally prepared that I wasn't having to repress my emotions, but instead I felt safe enough to allow them to just be present, to talk about what I knew, to answer the questions that were asked of me, to endure a really awful cross examination. And all of those things were okay because I knew that there were people in my corner that believed me. So when we got that verdict, it was even that much sweeter. I definitely think it helped me find my voice, especially during that time between the conviction and sentencing. So in Colorado, I think it's all states will they'll go through a pre-sentencing investigation. Michael and I have talked about this quite a bit. He doesn't remember sentencing at all, and for me, that was like that's my Survivor Super Bowl where I get up and I get to talk about the impacts, and that was empowering to me because I felt safe in that environment to speak about those things. I don't know that I would have been able to do that as well or as eloquently if I didn't feel that support from not just the prosecutors and law enforcement, but the entire community, my family, my friends, my college community, everyone that was surrounding me, telling me that they believed me.
Allison, going back, one comment I want to make, because people who have seen Kim's presentation will hear she has referred to herself as the quote unquote perfect victim because she was assaulted by a stranger. She didn't have a motive to concoct a story in the jury's mind. She immediately reported. She participated in the prosecution. We were successful in convicting the offender. And yet, and Kim's heard me say this, one of the most frustrating things about that case was in talking to the jury after. We had one juror who very specifically walked up to me and said, I want you to know something. If you wouldn't have had DNA results that identified the assailant, I would not have voted to convict. And to me, that was a stunning statement because we feel like we had done everything we could to show that Kim's report was credible. We did everything we could from an investigation standpoint to show that we had the right offender, and yet we still had a jury, after all of the indoctrination that we talked about and tried, who insisted upon having that rock solid DNA identification before she would vote to convict. That, I think, in and of itself shows how difficult some of these cases can be because we don't always have that rock solid DNA that somebody can hang their hat on and say, yes, that is the right offender. Or when we do, it's someone who's known to the victim, and all of a sudden the defense is able to argue that the victim had some kind of motive to concoct a story, and we're back to having to show from the get-go that the victim, the survivor, was credible in his or her account of what happened to them.
So is there a case that you can think of where you didn't have that rock solid DNA that you were able to successfully prosecute?
It actually happens more frequently than I think you would estimate, because we're able to in a compelling way show a jury that you don't always need that rock solid DNA, hard forensic science evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. As you asked me that, I'm thinking of multiple different cases that we prosecuted just in my office over the last 6 or 8 months out of our special victims unit, in which we don't always have that DNA evidence for whatever reason, and the jury still believes their survivor on the stand, and we are successful in prosecuting those. So it does happen with some regularity, certainly not as much as we would like as prosecutors, because we still have work to do in working with our juries, but it certainly does happen. I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, that's good. So let's talk a little bit about vicarious trauma for prosecutors.
Yay!
Vicarious trauma in prosecutors, a subject that in our world, I think until about, at least in my world, until about 5 or 6 years ago, was taboo. It's something we didn't talk about because it wasn't supposed to exist. We were supposed to be, as men and women who stand up in front of juries and advocate on behalf of survivors and victims, we're not supposed to take home with us our work. We're not supposed to internalize the horrible things that we see one human being do to another. We're not supposed to internalize seeing images of child pornography over and over and over, day after day after day. And that's the world I grew up in. We just didn't talk about it. And unfortunately, because we didn't talk about it, we have lost prosecutors to addiction. We've lost prosecutors to other segments of the workforce. We've lost some prosecutors to suicide. I prosecuted a case in Frederick, Colorado that was the absolutely horrific triple murder, and the woman who was murdered was pregnant with her unborn son. Some people will know the case I'm talking about, but I won't talk about the offender's name. It was one that drove home the point to me that vicarious trauma is a real thing. I was at home one night. I was looking at the crime scene photos, and just all of that trauma and pain that I had seen in other people kind of spilled over, and it was a very realistic, a very real moment, I should say, in my life, to show me that vicarious trauma is a real thing. And so we've worked very hard in the last 5 or 6 years to normalize that, or try to normalize that type of a conversation in prosecutors' offices specifically. And it's not just prosecutors. We try to emphasize that it is something that exists in secretaries, in the rest of our support staff, in our victim advocates, in our investigators. Anybody who comes into contact with some of these very traumatic, very complex cases is at risk for suffering from this kind of vicarious or secondary trauma. And we've worked very hard to try to, like I said, normalize that conversation. And like I said, we have a lot of work to go in that arena too, but it's real, and it impacts people. And if we're not willing to talk about that, then we failed out of the box.
Mm-hmm. I can actually remember a similar scenario. The very first time that I felt that personally was when I had a toddler. And, the agency that I worked for, we were a rape crisis center, but we also worked with victims of child sexual abuse. And when she was young and screaming at me one day, it just kind of sunk in deep in my bones of, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Without getting into a lot of details for her privacy, but it really hit hard of, what do I do now? This is my work. This is my career, and having to, figure out that balance. It's really tricky.
Absolutely. And above and beyond simply allowing that to be an acceptable topic of conversation in my office, instead of being a sign of weakness, it's something that you can walk into a supervisor's office and say, you know what, I'm having a really bad day. This is what I've had to endure. This is what happened in the courtroom, or this is the new case that I saw come across my desk. I just need to vent. I need to be able to verbalize how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, and not have that be a sign of weakness. Around the country, we know that prosecutors' offices are creating peer support programs, so that there is somebody who you can take a break from your desk, walk over to somebody's cubicle or office and say, hey, can I talk to you for 5 or 10 minutes? That's kind of a signal to say, this person needs help. They're reaching out for help, and we need to be listening, and we need to be accommodating that kind of allowance for expressing feelings. And we just haven't done that as a profession. The National DA's Association recognized several years ago in a task force I worked on that this is something that we have to work on a national level to make this a healthier profession. And we're getting there. We're working on it. Yeah. I'll be happy to talk about it as much as folks want to hear, because it's that important to me. as somebody who grew up in that environment where you didn't talk about it and you just sucked it up, did your job, and went home and found probably some unhealthy ways to cope with what you were dealing with, instead of simply talking about it, going and seeing a counselor or a therapist, finding somebody to verbalize with that can help you through those really bad days that we all have.
Mm-hmm. Kim, can you talk a little bit about it from your perspective? I mean, you worked as an advocate, you are a survivor advocate now, you have a very public presence on social media. Talk about it from your angle.
About the prosecuted, like the prosecution vicarious trauma, or just vicarious trauma in general. I find that this is something people are more likely to experience than they realize, and it's typically not until well after the fact. So if you use my case as an example, I was the quote primary victim because I was sexually assaulted. I also had two roommates at the time who were victims of burglary, but it was looked at as those aren't the main crimes or the bigger crime. And so their trauma that they were experiencing and actively trying to support me through that created a lot of vicarious trauma. It's my parents who weren't physically there for the crime, but are supporting me along the way. All of my sorority sisters, my friends, people who were around me also experience that vicarious trauma. And it's something that I think still as a culture we try to push down because, well, it's not that bad because we didn't experience what this person did. Or, we're constantly looking through our feeds and seeing some of the most traumatic incidents from around our community, our country, our world, and we're just supposed to scroll on to the next thing when you don't realize that every single thing that you are putting in to your brain is staying there in some capacity. When Michael's talking about vicarious trauma, it wasn't just that one thing where he opens it and suddenly, oh, it's
Right.
trauma. It's all the things that compound and lead up to that. And I think it's glorified in a way that PTSD looks like, hearing fireworks and suddenly being back in a combat zone, or for survivors, it's seeing a picture or a smell and suddenly you're in the fetal position. And that's not it. It's all of the things that surround us and go into that just build and build and build until your bucket is full of stress and trauma and it overflows and you don't get to pick when or where or who it spills on.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamic that you have right now with your social media presence and survivors reaching out and disclosing and kind of balancing?
Me or him?
You
You.
So
have a social media following.
I don't have.
he has a social media following. It's under my account, it would seem, but I think the big thing people are seeing is that whatever you are experiencing, whatever you're going through, it's normal. I say this all the time, but an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal. So just being as authentic as possible and being able to say, hey, this is something that I went through. It may not be every single day. It may be something that happened in the past, or it may be something that's coming up now. Whatever you're feeling is valid and understandable. So I do have a lot of survivors who reach out to me. I don't get to respond to every single one now, but I do make sure that there are always resources that are available. That's part of why I have loved partnering with EVA so much, is that we can still put out that information in a way that many people can not only consume for themselves, but share. Everybody knows someone who is going through something, and the ability to share things on social just the way that we are now makes it easier and more accessible, where we can have that interaction and that education for the good of everybody who wants to access it. That wasn't available when I was victimized and when my case went through. When I spoke out for the first time in 2007, that wasn't something that I could just hop on the Facebook or MySpace and connect with other survivors. And we're very lucky that we live in a time where now you can, and you know that you're not alone. So I've just loved everything that Eva has continuously put out that is shareable and helps you understand what you're going through a little bit better, to hopefully change the needle just a little bit and educate those future jury pools to start by believing.
Yeah. We have 1 minute left. Any last thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, what's been permeating my brain as we've been sitting here talking is for folks who are watching or who may watch this down the road, even if you don't have a Start by Believing campaign in your office, in your department, in your agency, please consider it, whether it's something that is specifically borrowed from EVAWI International or not. It is crucial. It is absolutely crucial to the work that we do, the work that we that we need to do, that we are believing survivors, victims from the outset. It doesn't mean we have to lock ourselves into believing them for all time, but we have to convey that message that we are starting by believing you so that we can get that report, so that we can do the work we need to do to try to get a prosecutable case in front of a judge or a jury. And so whether it's the official EVAW Start by Believing campaign or something like it, please invest in something like that because it is absolutely crucial to the work we're doing.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I think that's one of the important pieces, that when people are concerned about Start by Believing and whether or not it's appropriate for criminal justice professionals, I think there's this, misunderstanding that it's believe victims and there's nothing else. It's believe victims, thoroughly investigate, examine all the evidence, take all of the steps that you normally would in any case. Start by Believing is just the first step of that. It's not the only step.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, thank you to both of you. I really appreciate your time. I hope you both have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Allison.
Allison.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.